This is Judaism Unbound, episode 487. Pigs are very Jewish. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Lex Rofberg. Dan is also here today, but I'm kicking us off with the intro this time. Today, we are launching a short mini-series on a topic that gets Jews across the spectrum of ideology and denomination very ready to argue: the pig. And also, we're going to be talking about meat more generally in this mini-series: kosher meat, non-kosher meat, as a window into better understanding Jews in different eras and geographies. Today's guest will be Jordan Rosenblum, author of the National Jewish Book Award-winning book Forbidden, A 3,000-Year History of Jews and the Pig. We're excited to launch into a conversation about it with him and explore why this animal has provoked so much conversation among Jews and also about Jews over the course of multiple millennia. Before we do, though, a couple quick Judaism Unbound announcements, unbouncements, if you will. First, applications are open for our Unyeshiva certificate program in Unbound Judaism. Don't miss your chance to apply. The certificate program is an opportunity to enter into a course of study where you can develop Jewish knowledge, skills, and holy chutzpah. It's a transgenerational community of Jewish learning and growth, spanning many time zones, featuring a rich diversity of Jewish backgrounds and experiences, predicated on the ancient Jewish tradition of changing Jewish tradition. The deadline for applications is coming in just a few days as this episode is released, Sunday, June 15th. You can access application materials at judaismunbound.com/certificate, and we hope that you will. Another quick announcement, though we're keeping this one a little bit mysterious till next week. There will be a new addition to the Judaism Unbound family of podcasts very soon. Keep an eye on our social media accounts, on your email inbox, because you'll soon be hearing more about this new pod. In next week's episode, we'll have all the details for how you can listen to it and subscribe. Until then, your primary task is just get excited for it. So with that cliffhanger, we'll return to our guest for this week, Jordan Rosenblum. Jordan Rosenblum is the Belzer Professor of Classical Judaism at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His most recent book, Forbidden, A 3,000-Year History of Jews and the Pig, is the central topic of today's episode, and, as mentioned, it was honored as a 2024 National Jewish Book Award winner. According to the Wall Street Journal, Forbidden is an engaging and surprisingly cheerful study of that odd couple of the religious imagination, the Jew and the pig. In addition, Rosenblum is the author of Rabbinic Drinking: What Beverages Teach Us About Rabbinic Literature, The Jewish Dietary Laws in the Ancient World, as well as the co-editor of 4 volumes, including Feasting and Fasting: The History and Ethics of Jewish Food, and Animals and the Law in Antiquity. Jordan Rosenblum, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
It's great to be here.
Well, I think we all have our stories about how unkosher a pig is.
Pigs aren't kosher?
My wife often tells this story where she and a colleague who were working at a Jewish organization were having lunch together, and my wife ordered, I don't remember what exactly, a BLT, and her friend is sitting across from her, and when my wife orders that or takes a bite of that, she says, you eat pork? And my wife said to her friend, you literally have squid in your mouth. You're literally eating calamari right now. And somehow, though, her friend's sense was that pork is more unkosher than calamari, even though, according to the Bible, they're both equally unkosher. So I wanted to ask you as a starting point, if you can pinpoint it, when did the pig become more unkosher than anything else? And why has that been so long-lasting? Why are people so sure today that that's the case?
Thank you. This is why I love podcasts, because these are the questions I've wanted people to ask me for years, and my wife got tired of me pontificating on, right? So I've been waiting for someone to ask me, when did this happen, so I can just go. So great, here I'm ready. As you point out, the Bible, it's not there. If all you had was the Bible, there's no reason to think that pig is any more non-kosher than the camel, the rock badger, the squid, everything. In fact, aside from Leviticus and Deuteronomy, where it says don't eat pig is only mentioned 5 other times in the Bible. There are so many other biblically non-kosher animals that the Bible talks about.
And that's Bible, not just Torah, to clear, like all the dozens of books.
The Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, the entire Hebrew Bible. So if you're looking at the prophets, you're looking at 1st and 2nd Chronicles, etc. It only appears very rarely. They often talk about eagles, which are also biblically non-kosher, and they use that as a metaphor. Lions, there's so many other non-kosher animals. So if all you had was the Hebrew Bible and nothing happened thereafter, if you had it like a document from a group that no longer existed, you wouldn't think anything special of the pig. it really is in the Second Temple period, which, if anyone's familiar with Hanukkah, the story of Hanukkah, that's right around the time we're talking about, where suddenly it seems that Jews and non-Jews start noticing that Jews not eating pig is kind of weird. And I think that's also because that's the most readily available, obvious non-kosher animal. People were not eating camels that often. Jews could eat cows and pigs and goats, right? They just would slaughter them differently. But pig was it was eaten a lot. And so to not have that notice, but what you start to get in texts, and this is one of my favorite observations from this book that I made, is today when people think of Hanukkah, they think of the miracle of the oil. The first story we have that talks about the miracle of oil is the Babylonian Talmud, and the story is written hundreds of years after the Maccabees. If you read the book of the Maccabees, there are four of them, they talk a lot more about the pig, and they talk about it that Jews were forced to either eat pig or be martyred, be killed. And so the story of Hanukkah in its oldest form is more a story about the pig. And at that moment, the pig starts to be both internally amongst Jewish communities and externally amongst non-Jewish communities, seen as a distinctly Jewish practice and seen as something more, something bigger. And then what happens is 2,000 years of Jews and non-Jews putting more into it. And now today, I can't sit on the couch watching Netflix with my wife without seeing a show that I say, can you hit pause? I need to go grab my laptop and write notes because they just made a reference to pig that I need to add to my notes.
Work-life balance, Jordan. Work-life balance.
Yes,
Come on.
That's what I'm told, but I can't turn that part of my brain off. I'm watching a show and they make a joke about it. I need to have it, so I can look at it later, right? The fact that the pig has proven so powerful for that, for hundreds and thousands of years, people, both Jewish and non-Jewish, kept investing meaning of it. The more multiple meanings you have, the more interesting it is to people with different perspectives. And the pig has proven quite flexible.
Just two other questions about kind of ancient times before we maybe get to that history of how the pig has lived in Jewish history as that symbol. But when we think about ancient times, so number one, just to understand, you think that the reason that the pig became the most unkosher thing was less about its being more unkosher and more about just its being more ubiquitous. It was the thing that people avoided eating that was around most often, that was available to eat most often, so therefore became the most prominent, let's say, symbol of keeping kosher. And then my other question is basically, is the eating of pig by Jews as a kind of sign of rebellion or as a kind of a sign of what you might call a very Jewish act, right? I'm eating pig Jewishly to show that I'm not that kind of Jew or something. Is that as ancient as the prohibition on the pig itself?
To answer your first question, I will say that that's just my theory. There's no one comes out and says that, right? But even let's look at the story you said to open this, right? What is on the menu? I think if you look at menus, you're more likely to find pork products than squid, right? You find squid in one dish. Right? I bet if you looked at that menu, you'd find pork products in multiple ones. I think if you ask the average person on the street, they will be more familiar with pork not being kosher than squid. And I've spent a lot of time, people coming up to me and telling me stories or me asking people, because of this history, also pig feels more. But I think it fundamentally begins with, it was more readily available. If you look at this in Roman times, for example, they ate a lot of pig. So now your second part is interesting because one of the things I'm often reminding students and audiences, and I point out in the book too, is don't assume that at any time and place, from 3,000 years ago to today, every Jew who expressed a strong Jewish identity did or did not keep kosher. Evidence suggests continuously that there are Jews who did, Jews who didn't, and Jews who sometimes did. And there are a myriad of jokes about this. I quote one in the book that I love. That's someone is immigrating from Europe, comes to Ellis Island, and they look in his luggage and they see 5 sets of false teeth. They say, why do you need these? He says, well, I'm an observant Jew, so I need 1 set for meat and 1 set for milk because I can't have the same teeth eat the same. And he says, okay, that explains why you have 2, but why do you have 4? Says, well, on Passover, you can't have anything that it comes in contact with leaven, so I need a separate set for meat and milk. He says, okay, so that's 4. What's the 5th one? Sometimes I like to have a little bacon. Right? And that's a great joke, but it summarizes the complex identity. So first you have the fact that for some people, it's like it's harmless. And then there are people at different times and places who felt that they consciously wanted to transgress. And this is actually, I'm using this also as an opportunity. There was one reviewer of the book who it was an Orthodox rabbi, who got very angry. He thought that I was celebrating the fact that there are Jews who chose to transgress and view their Jewish identity as eating pig. And that actually kind of annoys me because he fundamentally misread my book, because I'm not celebrating. What I'm saying is that throughout time, we've seen Jews who have chosen to keep kosher, and that's great. The Jews have chosen to not keep kosher, and that's great. And often they've used pig as a way to symbolize one or the other. And what I was arguing is that the fact there were some Jews who chose to transgress and eat pig. There's a trope of Jews eating pig on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, right? And to say, look how not Jewish I am. And what I argue is, well, that's actually transgressing in a Jewish way. You're marking something. And so I'm not saying it's wonderful. I'm not saying it's better or worse. What I'm saying is that's part of this story. It needs to be part of the story. It's neither good nor bad. It's interesting. And so there are evidence of Jews doing that along. But where I start to see it, I argue, is in early modern times, there was this person who claimed to be the Messiah named Shabbatai Tzvi, and his followers chose to transgress and do things like on the Sabbath eat pork as a way of showing, look, we're transgressing Jewish practice, but as a form of Jewish identity. And then you start to see in modernity many Jews who consciously choose to eat pig and do it to mark their rebellion from it. Or my favorite example of this was from Soviet Russia in the 1920s, 1930s. Jews who were trying to show that they've thrown off the opium of the masses. They are good communists. So how do they do that? They get together and they have a collective pig farm where they raise pigs. They're raising pigs to show how not Jewish they are, but it only makes sense if you realize that they're Jewish, right? So what I argue is I'm not celebrating it, but I'm fascinated by it because in transgressing it, you're transgressing in a way that marks your Jewish identity. For so many different people in different times and places, they're using the pig to talk about Jewish or non-Jewish identity.
Yeah, I'm excited about this for a number of reasons. One is autobiographically. I'm going to try to find a photo of it because there is one somewhere. But when I was 5 or 6 years old, we had to do a project for school where we make a little poster and it's like, this is my favorite sports team and this is what I do on weekends and this is my, like, whatever, like the little poster where you say things about yourself, and it had favorite food. And I was sitting with my mom deciding, I don't even remember this. I was very, very young, but she tells it very vividly. And she asked me, like, what do you want to put as your favorite food? I said, not bacon, not some kind of pig product. I said pork directly. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I actually loved being Jewish. Like, I think elsewhere on that same poster, I had like my favorite time of year is Passover or something. Like, I was not doing it transgressively, and I was in a context where like it wasn't like a big statement, and I did not experience it as like making me not so Jewish. And I also like grew up going to my grandparents, and my grandma's specialty was she made me peanut butter and bacon sandwiches. Like, I don't know if that's a common thing, but that's what my grandma made.
I've never heard of it before. My wife has gotten into a YouTuber, peanut butter and pickle sandwiches.
I do that as well.
Which I will go on the record as saying is better than it sounds. I'm not as enamored with it as she is, but it's better than it sounds.
This isn't the peanut butter and pickle. I'm part of the peanut butter and pickle agenda. Try it, folks, because people always have this trajectory from doubting it to begrudgingly liking it. That's what happens. But so back to my peanut butter and bacon sandwiches. It really wasn't a big statement for me growing up. And I did not, I knew in the back of my mind that like some Jews didn't eat bacon or pork, and it just didn't really bother me. As I grew older, I did eventually, like, the dominoes fell. And what's interesting is my first domino of keeping kosher was I gave up eating pig products. Like, I stopped eating bacon. That I did that before I gave up shellfish, which in turn was before I decided I had a complicated relationship to meat and dairy because I connected to some Jewish groups that don't think that's prohibited. But I eventually reached this place of being a vegetarian, and kind of all of that went out the window. But in my head, I more didn't eat pork than I didn't eat beef, which is not a logical thing, but it feels true.
It is exactly what I argue in the book. I think it makes perfect sense if you look at the trajectory of that, why that feels different.
Yeah. And so my question is, I think this gives us a window into different kinds of Jewish groups over time, but I kind of want to jump time to the more contemporary period. I think we'll jump back and forth between more ancient and more contemporary. But the end of your book closes with this incredible moment of a couple folks debating whether Sandy Koufax eating a ham sandwich the same week that he didn't pitch on Yom Kippur, which that actually appears to have happened, whether that is something that should cause us like deep anxiety or not. And I'm somebody who would say we should celebrate people of whatever Jewish variety, regardless of whether they're eating ham or not. But I'm curious, like, how might we conceptualize the magnitude, the force that argument might have for both those people?
Well, let's unpack this a bit. First, I will acknowledge, so far I've only discovered one typo in the book, which is I mistakenly said, make this clear, that the Los Angeles Dodgers, he was then on the Brooklyn Dodgers. The amount...
That's going to upset some people.
People, male lawyers from their law firms emailing me to correct the record because their father, who grew up in Brooklyn, would never tolerate that. So I want to go on the record.
That's like saying there's like bagels from San Francisco instead of New York or something. It was a mistake. I freely acknowledge that. I don't know how it got passed. Okay. But this is a great moment because I've taught an Intro to Judaism in a course I used to teach here regularly. Here is UW-Madison. So in a course, Introduction to Judaism, I've taught an article about Sandy Koufax because I find there's a mythology around this event where he was pitching in the World Series. He's the best left-handed pitcher of all time, Jewish or otherwise. Fight me on it. I'm ready. And it's the World Series, and it's falling on Yom Kippur. And he's someone who's not observant, but it's a time when ethnic identity is being contested in America, where people are really thinking about political and cultural statements of what it means. And he just can't get his head around pitching on Yom Kippur. So he doesn't. Spoiler alert, but enough time has passed that if you don't know this, that's okay. His team ends up winning and he pitches really well. So it becomes, but at this moment, many Jews in America saw he was such a wonderful pitcher. He was such an important icon. And he didn't pitch on Yom Kippur. Now, the mythology is that he was seen at every synagogue in Minneapolis, where it was the Brooklyn Dodgers were going against the Minnesota Twins. All reports, including his own report, is actually he never attended a single synagogue that day. He stayed in his hotel. But that ruins the mythology. I'm sorry if I killed Santa Claus for many people out there. And so there's this great mythology around that. And that's why I love that little nugget of that sandwich. How could he at that moment, with that left hand that was touched by God, touch bacon, right? How could that happen at that moment? It's that all that power together, because what he was doing was so seen as so symbolic. But why couldn't he do both? Why couldn't he, even not going to synagogue, even eating bacon the whole time? He's still making a symbolic stand about what that means and about identity, right? But there's a desire to make him pure in that moment. I'm going to put on my fancy scholar hat now, right? When people talk about identity is actually comprised of two different things. There's what I think I'm doing, and there's what you perceive me as doing. And when they don't match, interesting things happen. You might need me to not eat bacon and to go to synagogue that day, but I might need to just not pitch that day to make my statement, right? And that tension is what I'm fascinated in. So that was a great example of there's so much mythology around that moment when he didn't pitch for the Brooklyn Dodgers. I've led debates in Sunday school classrooms and occasionally with adults about Hank Greenberg's situation. Hank Greenberg had a similar situation.
Yes, he did.
And he made a choice. People leave out the parts of the story like the ham sandwich. And in Hank Greenberg's case, he made a conscious choice to not play on Yom Kippur. Right. But before that, there was a game on Rosh Hashanah, and he made the conscious choice to play on Rosh Hashanah. And he was actually, when you look at it as a two-part choice, he was consciously looking at the situation and saying, I have an allegiance to my team, the Detroit Tigers. I also have an allegiance to Jewishness and to the people looking to me as a kind of exemplar, whether that's something I chose to be or not. And he split the difference. He showed connection to both, prioritizing the team on Rosh Hashanah and prioritizing Jewishness on Yom Kippur. And what's interesting about that is it points maybe to a kind of elevated importance to Yom Kippur in some folks' mind that I think parallels it's like, it's not more forbidden to play a sport on Yom Kippur than Rosh Hashanah, but in the same way you said pork becomes kind of more unkosher, more treif, there's a way that for some folks, not all, Yom Kippur is kind of quote unquote the big one. And so I guess my question is like for Jews that are really interested in like the perception here, I'm interested in Jewish conversations, ancient and contemporary, in terms of how we're talking about the role of pork. We're going to get to like how non-Jews understand Jewish relationships to pork too. But like, you know, whether it's Hank Greenberg or Sandy Koufax or the vast majority of Jews who are not professional baseball players, we are kind of aware of this act as being perceived by others. And that has an impact on what happens. So like, what's going on there? What's some of the history of that? How might we unpack this perception question?
Okay, so a few things. One is, I forget if it was Hank Greenberg or Sandy Koufax that consulted a rabbi about playing on Rosh Hashanah and got like permission by an interesting interpretation of finding an ancient text that talks about playing on that day or something. So the other thing is, I don't know, I love my endnotes. I don't know if anyone ever bothers to read them. Those are, I have lots of puns and fun facts hidden in them. And one is actually, footnote 124, I point out that actually another Hank Greenberg fun fact was that he regularly had anti-Semitic jibes yelled at him. And a statement goes that they shouted to him about Moses and about pork chops. So people were making pork jokes at Hank Greenberg from the stands.
Yeah. And relevant to that story, Hank Greenberg is playing 3 decades earlier in the 30s.
Yeah.
In a time that, I mean, the 60s were also a loaded time for anti-Semitism, but 30s like extra loaded, clearly, for all sorts of clear reasons.
As the pig comes, and I say in the book, I usually refer to it as the pig because to me it's about so much more than just pork, right? It's what it symbolizes, and it's an animal, and it's a food, and they're using all of those things at once. As it comes to mean more, every interaction with it is more loaded. Let's go back to your very opening thing, the squid. If I were to try and write an article about squid, it would be short. I have an idea one day of writing an article about shellfish. It's not gonna be a book, it'll be an article, because there's only so much that can be said about it. But as the pig comes to mean more, the perception of how you interact with it, to be seen with it. I was recently asked, what's my favorite pig joke? It's kind of a tie now that I've had some time to think about it. On the spot, I'll tell you the joke that I said. The other one was the teeth joke, so I'll get them both out. This one was a standard joke that I heard many times growing up, which was, right, a rabbi who's never eaten pork wants to try pig, so he goes several towns over for a place that's known for its pig, and he orders the full-on hog, and he's sitting there waiting, and just before it comes out, who walks in but 2 of his congregants? He starts to panic, but they come over, they see him, they start talking to him, and then the door opens from the kitchen, and out comes a full hog with its apple in its mouth on a full tray, and they place it down in front of him. They walk away. The congregants' jaws hit the floor. They don't know what to do. And he takes a moment to think, puffs up his chest, and says, "This place is ridiculous. You order an apple, and this is how they serve it to you." Right? And that joke, right, gets to all of those things of perception. Let me hit on both Yom Kippur and the pig. Starting 2,000 years ago, there was a Jew who lived right on both sides of the zero, named Philo of Alexandria. And so 2 things that are relevant to what we just said. Number one is when you talked about Yom Kippur being so big, he actually has a text where he talks about Yom Kippur, and he says, Jews who care nothing about Judaism, on Yom Kippur, they're going out of their way to prove to everyone how pious they are. So the Jew who only shows up to synagogue on Yom Kippur goes back at least 2,000 years, right? So he also talks about pig being the most delicious and amazing meat. Now, he's someone who, according to everything he describes of himself, never ate pig, right? So how does he know it? But what I'd say is you find several Jewish texts by Jews who purport to have never eaten pig to talk about how amazing the meat. It's the most delicious meat. So I think there's also this talking it up thing. And so it becomes if you say it's the most delicious and you choose not to eat it, look how you're giving yourself a nice pat on the back. But there's also, that speaks to the desire for it. What's going on? What does it mean to eat that, right? There's that temptation. And so what you're seeing with that perception is Jews, non-Jews are investing it with more and more meaning. And so you have to take a stance on the pig if you're Jewishly identified. I keep going back to the squid. You can live your whole life without referencing squid, right? Go look for squid in the historical record of Jews, and you're going to find a few things. But go look for a pig, and you can write a book.
How does it move from being something that we don't eat to something that we almost shouldn't even associate with? Because when you think about other non-kosher animals like a camel, we love camels. We should ride camels everywhere, or a dog or a cat. I mean, they're wonderful to be in the house, but, of course, you shouldn't eat them. But a pig, it's like a Jew and a pig just don't belong in the same room together. How does that evolve?
Where that really starts to come about is amongst the group of Jews that I've spent the most of my academic, professional, and personal time thinking about, or the ancient rabbis, right? So you have in the Second Temple period this notice of pig means something more. The rabbis inherit that. We're now on the other side of the zero after 70 CE, the destruction of the Second Temple. They're a group who's trying to account for how you live. I always imagine this as a movie. If this were a movie preview for the rabbis, it would be, maybe ominous music in the background. And I would say in a very deep voice, in a world without a temple, the rabbis rise from the ashes to bring Judaism back to the people. Coming summer 2026. And so the rabbis are trying to make meaning of this world post-temple. And they've inherited this pig meaning more. And so they start talking about it. And there are a few things they do. One is they can't bring themselves to utter the name pig. They start to refer to it by other terms. That thing, that other thing, devar acher, they'll say in Hebrew. They'll use euphemism over euphemism. And once you start being uncomfortable even referring to something, I quote Harry Potter in that, right? They talk about Voldemort. Dumbledore says, if you don't name it, you're giving it so much power. But that's exactly what they do. And then they start to talk more about this. And the other interesting thing is the rabbis understand the pig completely differently than Second Temple period. If you look at the book of Maccabees, the choice is eat pig or be martyred. The rabbis, as they interpret a biblical commandment to live by the commandments, they say, if you're faced with death, except for three things, right, which are forbidden sexual relations, murder, and idolatry, you should go ahead and do it rather than die. So if someone says, I will kill you unless you eat pork, eat pork. I remember my grandmother, Zichronah Levacha, may her memory be blessed, she needed a pig valve for her heart. And she called me very upset. She's someone who's kept kosher her whole life. What could she do? And I had to explain to her that no matter what perspective you look at in Judaism, it's not a problem whatsoever, going back as far as the Talmud. Save a life. You're not eating it. Even if you needed to eat it. If you needed to eat pig to survive, eat it. You need to survive.
Which, couldn't you see that as one of many rabbinical kind of polemics on the Hasmoneans or on the realm of the Maccabee story?
Yeah, it could be. But what I actually think is it's different. So in the Second Temple period, the Hasmoneans are influenced by Greek and Roman philosophy of the idea of to martyr, you need to testify that you are not compromising your. So to eat pig would be to compromise your principled stance. The rabbis, because of that interpretation, say, well, you're still keeping your principled stance. Your principled stance is, this is not one of the things, all these other things, right? The idea that they chose those, idolatry is fundamentally undermining the one major principle, right? Forbidden sexual relations is seen as so beyond the pale, right? And murder is, the rabbis spend a lot of time talking about the difference between murder and homicide and other things, right? And the thing of murder is you're choosing whose blood is redder, right? You're not defending a life, you're not doing, you were playing God there. Other than that, go ahead. So for them, you can eat pig at those moments, but they spend so much time talking about the complexities of it. And so now what you then start to get is they've made an allowance, but they're still wringing their hands about it. They're starting to tease out these things. And that's where you start to get that narrative. And what I argue is, so it starts there, but then the hardest chapter for me to write was the medieval chapter, because I start arguing in the medieval chapter that it becomes a story of non-Jews, also the sheer anti-Semitism of it. It's being used by non-Jews the stories of the Maccabees were kind of a one-off event. In the Middle Ages, it's story after story after story of using the pig to harm and mock and murder. You can't get away from it meaning so much more then.
First thing I want to say to our Southern Jews listening, you can totally email us this if you want, but don't be too offended at the idea that there couldn't be a book on squid. There's plenty of folks in New Orleans that could pull together a book-length exploration of shellfish and Jews in the South.
I have plenty of notes about the shellfish. And in fact, I'll throw one of the little tidbits out now because it does appear in one of my books, that the earliest reference I could find to refer, because the Hebrew Bible says when you're talking about fish, they must have fins and scales. It actually doesn't go too in depth about aquatic creatures. The earliest text I can find that then starts to identify shellfish as bottom feeders and dirty and mucky was a first century Christian text talking about those biblical references. So
interesting.
Right. So it's the Epistle of Barnabas for anyone who is watching at home.
Which is really interesting in a few ways and gets at some of the, like, it's about what comes out of our mouth versus what goes into our mouth takes. We'll put some show notes to Barnabas.
That's a great reference to the New Testament, which it's actually a poop joke. If people are not people don't realize, it's like Jesus is making a poop joke. And I like to teach that to my students because they don't know what to do with that fact. I mean, and the other thing that I love about, although I end up in this book talking about medieval and early modern and modern things, I'm an ancient guy at heart. And people have this view that we are weird humans today, but 2,000 years ago, everyone was pious and would never make that joke. And there are so many facts that undermine it. One of the things, he's making that joke, but it's to make a broader point. But also, Jesus, from every record we have of him from Gospels and such, never ate biblically non-kosher food, never ate with non-Jews. He would eat with Jews who were seen as socially undesirable. It's not until you get to Paul. Paul radically reinterprets that.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up I don't know if it's allegorical or at least like the interpretive moves of understanding shellfish as quote unquote bottom feeders, which that's become, even for folks, whether they keep kosher or not, I think when Jews are asked, like, why are shellfish not kosher? That answer is like more common knowledge than a lot of other kinds of Jewish answers. Like people will say, oh, well, they're bottom feeders. Like they sort of scrounge around on the bottom of the ocean. Which is interesting that became like such a popular thing. But the allegorical piece or the interpretive maneuvers piece, this gets us back to the Bible text a little. Chewing their cud. I'll confess, I've thought a lot about kosher keeping from a lot of different directions. I mentioned that I'm a vegetarian, and half the time I don't even really know if I keep kosher because like mostly I'm a vegetarian, but then as a result, I kind of keep kosher. And it's like a thing I think about, but I had not spent much time ruminating on what chewing cud means. Yep. I haven't spent much time thinking about, pigs, the thing that does make them, I'm not going to say special in the Bible, but the one thing you could point to that makes them at least differentiated from the camel and the other things we've mentioned is that they're the example given for something that has a cloven hoof, right? And does not chew its own cud. Now, that's really interesting because animals you can observe as looking a certain way. You kind of have to focus more to figure out how they chew stuff. And so my question is like chewing your own cud as a particular, like, you could tell us how different people have understood that as a metaphor, but also more generally, like, I'm curious to hear about the ways in which this is sort of moralized, like the ways people try to give or not give reason to the pig prohibition.
So I've been thinking about this for a long time. I wrote a book in 2016 where I talk about the ancient Jewish dietary laws, like all sorts of ancient people talking about what they meant. And I thoroughly convinced myself, I don't know if I convinced other people, right? The few facts that are relevant here. Number one is if you look at the biblical text, it doesn't give you the why. It just says because God says so. And people, if you've ever studied anything you've learned about Mary Douglas, you learn about all these other people, they're interesting theories. I think they're completely and fundamentally flawed and wrong because I actually think that it just says because God says so. But if you focused on that, if we could turn the page from Leviticus for a second, what you have is a rich, fascinating history from very shortly after those biblical texts appeared to today of people saying, so new? What does that mean? Why? And they're trying to understand it. And I said, now that you can understand why, they're reading into their logic of it. You're talking about observable things. Let's start with the Hebrew Bible. Fun fact, God doesn't seem to understand basic anatomy because the hare, it says, chews the cud. The hare does not chew the cud. It is not a ruminant. It moved its mouth a lot. I live in Madison, Wisconsin. I look at my backyard. We have tons of rabbits running around. They're moving their mouth all the time. I have not dissected them, but I know from looking into this that they do not chew the cud. The biblical text gets that fundamentally wrong, right? So you're talking about observation. If you didn't, again, I'm going to point back to what I said earlier. If you didn't have this rich afterlife, you wouldn't think anything of it. You'd say, okay, so it has, this one does that one does that. You'd move on with your life. It's because of what people read back into it. Now, let's bring up your favorite man, Philo. He says, let's look at the biblical laws about domesticated quadrupeds. That's a big term for domesticated animals that have 4 legs. Those are your cows, your sheep, your pigs, your goats, etc. Now, if you go to one of his texts where he's talking about that, Philo says that what are the criteria for ingestion? What does God say? You have to have split hooves, you have to chew the cud. And Philo says this is an allegory. This is a metaphor for the proper thinker, because the split hoof is there's a twofold path in life. There's virtue and there's vice. And if you only eat animals that have split hooves, you will constantly think about choosing the good or the bad option. And it will be a lesson that was embodied, that goes into your body, of always choosing the virtue.
Because of the split because of the like.
That's what split hooves represent. And now chewing the cud is, and you stole my joke about ruminant. The idea of ruminating on something is, right, it's you chew food and you bring it down to your first stomach and then you ruminate on it, which means you regurgitate it, which we also think about like we talk about regurgitating knowledge, right? But also that's what studying is you do the reading before class and then you go to class and you reflecting on that and bring it back up. Then you go home and you reread your notes and you bring it back up and think about it and you digest it, like digesting knowledge. All of these things are things we use in English language all the time. And so for him, if you don't eat those animals, so if you eat the pig, you're going to miss the lesson. Now, Philo, by the way, is someone he was trying to talk to 2 audiences. He was trying to talk to a Greek audience to explain that Jewish thought and what he called Mosaic legislation, the Hebrew Bible, was the most Greek rational thought. But he was also trying to talk to Jewish audience to basically say he was still an observant Jew himself. And so he believed you have to follow the law, but then you also have to understand the metaphorical and allegorical meanings. So with that, he said, if you don't follow those rules, then you're not going to understand, embody, and practice proper thought. I understand that this might be part of a series where you're going to talk to John Ephron in his marvelous book, All Consuming. He talks about like trichinosis and how that comes about in Germany at that time and how that's used as part of that discussion. That's fascinating about, oh, this is all about trichinosis. No, it was when trichinosis becomes a known entity, people start layering it on to that meaning. And so it doesn't tell me about the ancient Israelites, because as one scholar once pointed out, if that were the rule, it should be, thou shalt not eat pig that is pink in the middle. Just cook it through. And also I like to point out, then that's assuming everyone who ate pig were a bunch of idiots. But all of these moments where people are interpreting or reinterpreting it tell you about their time and place. Or the example I give for my students is in religious studies, we have this thing where we talk about a practice being overdetermined or underdetermined. Overdetermined, and I mentioned this earlier, is having a very specific meaning. Underdetermined means you can layer meanings on it. It's like an onion that you keep peeling away layers. And the example I give for that is I say to my students, how many of you have heard of Hanukkah? Tons of hands go up. I said, how many of you have heard of Yom Nicanor, Nicanor's Day? No one raises their hand, except maybe one person who took a course with me before. Dan is raising. I'm seeing some hands being raised on the Zoom screen. And if you're at home raising your hand, wonderful for you. Yom Nicanor, Nicanor's Day, and Hanukkah are both mentioned in the same ancient text, except from a few of my, I would call them dorky, but I'm the same way, my beloved scholarly friends who post on Facebook every Nicanor's Day, Happy Nicanor's Day. No one knows what it is, because the second they forgot who Nicanor was, people didn't layer meanings onto it. And that's why I love about this story of the pig. I keep finding more about it, and again, it's not telling me about the ancient text. What it's telling me is about a lived tradition of groups of people who struggled to make meaning and to understand themselves and others. And they found the pig to be a useful way of talking about it.
Okay, so can we get into that more deeply? Because that is so interesting. And I guess I'm wondering both in terms of whether it's comparative religion or comparative anthropology kind of thing. Like, is this a common thing where a group of people will develop some core symbols like this? And do they tend to be about food? Like, is there something about the disgust or the other kind of reflexes?
Right. It's something that I say, and again, I will shout out again, John Ephron. He mentions this in the beginning of his book too. Every culture eats and chooses not to eat foods that are otherwise edible. And I once was, I'm in Madison, Wisconsin. I once opened up a talk where I said that every recorded society eats and chooses not to eat something that is edible. And someone came up to me afterwards, and they were one of the indigenous tribes to Madison, and they said, we eat everything. Yeah, so my stepfather was an anthropologist of Native American Indians, so I have some background in things. So I said, "Are you a member of a clan?" Which many indigenous groups are. And she said, "Of course, I'm a member of a bear clan." I said, "Great. Would you eat a bear?" She said, "No, no, you don't eat your own animal." And then she stopped and she looked at me and said, "Wait, is that a food rule?" Yes, it is, right? Anyone else, if you're a member of an eagle clan, you can eat bear, you can't eat eagle. You're a member of a bear clan, you can eat eagle, can eat bear, right? Food is a great way of ordering the world. Lex, you told a story before about your childhood and writing about your favorite foods, right? We could all talk about stories of what our favorite foods are, what it means to eat something, moments where a meal meant something. You go down the list of ways that food communicates meaning, or anthropologists will point out when one group immigrates to somewhere else, that marriage patterns and food patterns tend to be the things that last longest. They'll switch language, they'll switch other elements of culture, but they tend to still marry within the group and to eat food items. There are story after story of any society you can look at that will talk and invest with meaning with food, and it's because it's so fundamental, right? You need to eat it to live, and so therefore what you eat communicates meaning, and what you don't eat communicates meaning. Like there are television shows in America, right, that are, the premise is forcing people to eat bugs, right, to make money or something. Well, there's a lot more in the Hebrew Bible to talk about what bugs are kosher or not than there are about what fish are kosher or not. Low in fat, high in protein, readily available. But they're all reasons bugs would be a great food source. Squirrels, horses, dogs, right? There's so much meaning in that. And that's why people like me spend a lot of time overthinking it.
Yeah, I'm going to do something that's always dangerous, which is ask a scholar a question with the word should. We've learned over the years with interviews that when you ask a should question to scholars, they always start with, "Well, I'm not an advocate. I'm not,
Okay.
but like I am going to give a little bit of a should question. You can dodge if you want, but I'd love to hear some of your thoughts." But like my should question is like, so you've given us a beautiful deep dive into some of the origins of pig prohibition, how they intensified and pig became not just prohibited, but like prohibited squared, like more prohibited than other prohibited things. My should question is like, what should that mean for us as Jews today? And also the should question is like, given that you said this before, and I certainly have been impacted by teachings like this, throughout Jewish history, there have been Jews, including Jews who like are connecting very deeply to their Judeanness or Jewishness or Israeliteness, whatever the era, like who have actually not followed that rule and have eaten pig. And my should question is like, there's that today too, right? And so I mentioned I've had different stages of my life. At some stages, I've joyfully eaten pig products to the point that it's my favorite food. And at other points, I have actively not eaten them. And if I were to look at those stages of my life, I would not describe either one of them as being like more Jewish than the other. To me, that should be a should. That's not just a descriptor. Like I believe in a Jewish world, despite my commitment to vegetarianism, despite my commitment even to some parts of kashrut, of kosher keeping, I believe in a world where we would look at somebody who actively orders the BLT, like Dan described, and we would not only be okay with it and like see that as a Jewish act, but in some cases, for me, I will say I'm inspired by a lot of those people, like people who, whether they're doing it as like the transgressive Shabtai Tzvi thing, or they've decided that that's not the hinge on which their Judaism rests. Their hinge is other things. I think there's different of those people who are our own listeners. I'm genuinely really inspired by people who are able to connect very deeply to their Jewishness, their Judaism in other ways, and do very proactively and have made a conscious choice that, you know what? For me, it's not about the food that's going into my mouth. That doesn't really do it for me in terms of locking down my commitments to Judaism. I'm impressed by people who just don't lose sleep about that, and whether other Jews or the rest of society are going to think they're less Jewish because they eat this thing. So my should question is like, how might our knowledge of history that people have been eating pig and still being Jewish impact how we act today?
Okay, I'm going to should you. I'll lay down some shouldage. Everyone eats, and how you eat communicates meaning. I believe, academically and personally, that you should take some time to think about what your personal values, ethics are. I have no investment about what they are. You can choose whatever they are, Jewish, non-Jewish, etc. You should take some time to think about what your values and morals and ethics are, and then think about how you eat puts that into practice. Now, it could be that you care about ethical treatment of animals, or food systems, or environmental impact, or sustainable models of businesses and the employees who work for them. There are all sorts of values and ethics that you might hold. And then do some research into thinking about how what you eat communicates that to yourself and others. There might be a flexibility of situation, right? You might distinguish between how you eat at your home versus how you eat in someone else's home. If someone invites you to their home, I generally don't talk about myself and what my own food practices are, because I find that people then read everything through the lens of, oh, you do or you don't. Everyone wants to know, do you eat pig? Do you not? And I refuse to answer at this point, because you're then going to read everything I say through it. But what I will say is that I have a principle of being a little more flexible with the way I approach my food practices if I'm invited into your home. Because one of my main values is, if I've decided to enter your home, I have decided that I want to build a relationship with you. And food can both build relationships and erect barriers between them. So if you might ask me, oh, what do you want? And then I might talk about general things. But if I'm going to go to your home, I will have flexibilities whereas if I'm going to be buying food for my own home, I'm going to have different values. So, and then what I would say is also, people change over time. Changing food practices, reevaluating food practices is actually a great thing too. Just the same way you might reevaluate the deductions you take in your taxes, the clothes that you have. And so shifting relationship to pig, you can be equally expressing Jewish identity and have completely opposing and deferring and nuanced changing views on pig. In all things, you're still orienting around yourself about how you are understanding your Jewish identity at the time. And you could still say the through thread is, I understood myself to have a strong Jewish identity, but how it manifested, how I put it into practice changed. It makes perfect sense to me what you're saying. It works better in a podcast setting than it does in a social setting. When someone says something to me and I said, oh, my scholarship can account for your personal decisions and your life choices, right? That doesn't necessarily endear you to someone over hors d'oeuvres, pigs in a blanket, if you will.
Nice.
But in this case, I'd say, yeah, it makes perfect sense with that. And so if I'm going to come out with any should, it's the fact is your food choices communicate meanings and values. And you should, meaning y'all, you plural, should take a moment to think about what that means, right? You might a few months later say, I'm not feeling that anymore. So let me think about that. What does that mean? I know many vegetarians who are like, well, I'm a vegetarian, except when I go home to my mom, like it's too awkward with my family. It would be seen as offensive, right? Or people who eat meat, but then they go home and then they don't in that setting because it would be seen as offensive, right? So that flexibility isn't an inconsistency. It can be part of a broader system.
When I was listening to you talking about the capacity to change the way that you eat to reflect your values, that both speaks to me and doesn't. It speaks to me in that I totally agree with you. And I think that it's really important for all of us to think about what we choose to eat as a reflection of our values. I happen to be a person who has food aversions. I've never been a good eater, to my parents' chagrin when I was young. It had nothing to do with any kind of philosophy or any kind of kosher laws. It was just that I wasn't a good eater. I found a lot of things unappealing and disgusting. And my wife and I have had this debate over whether or not I keep kosher, because I take the position that I don't keep kosher because I don't really believe in those particular laws. I do believe in other ways that we should think about how we eat, but those particular rules and regulations, they don't speak to me for various reasons, including that I think the not mixing milk and meat is a misreading of the Torah. But the reality is that I don't eat pork and shellfish. And my wife says, so that means you keep kosher. And I'm like, no, I think keeping kosher is in the head, is to follow a philosophy. And she says, no, keeping kosher is in the mouth. It's what you actually eat and don't eat. The challenge for me is that even if I decided in my head, which I have, that not eating pig is not something that's meaningful to me, I still couldn't bring myself to do it. And I wonder if there's a way in which that is also true of people who don't have food aversions the way that I do, but that there's something else going on for them where they say, this animal was used to condemn our people for thousands of years. Who am I to be the one that's going to, somehow change the nature of this in our society? So I'm wondering if there are stories of both positive and negative. I mean, I think about how, there's just so many interesting stories in your book about how Jews had to stand on the carcass of a pig to swear in non-Jewish courts, or Karl Marx ate matzah and pig sandwiches. I'm just sort of wondering, like, what do you think sort of are some of the pieces of the Jewish story with pig, of the last 2,000 years that you kind of feel either do or don't give strength to that notion that this is something that maybe some of us ought to feel like we should do because of some sense of connectivity to a long chain?
Okay. Yeah. So there's a few things I would say. What I said still holds for you, because even you don't have to eat something to have a value of it. You can say, I don't personally like that, but were I to not have that aversion, this is where I would follow them. Your process of what you eat and don't eat, you're still thinking of the intentionality of it, right? Like if someone, this gets to, like she said earlier, right, that you're a vegetarian, you don't even know if that means you keep kosher. The question comes, and this has been debated in various factors in Jewish, also studied Christian history too, the idea of what role does intentionality plays in, right? Like if you do the right thing, but not with the right intentionality, did you still do the right thing, right? If you go and mutter all the prayers on Saturday morning, you mumble through your silent Amida, you make sure you stay for Musaf, you actually listen to the rabbi's sermon and don't make a snarky comment about it. Like you do all those things. Have you fulfilled that role if you didn't have the intentionality of it or not? Right? This is debates that people have had. So let's remove it from food for a second. So you could still debate that and still have I would argue you could still have a principled stance on something that you don't participate in. Now, story by Jonathan Safran Foer in his book On Eating Animals talks about this moment where he talked to his grandma about surviving the Holocaust. And he was talking about how towards the end of it, she stumbles across I think it was a Russian farmer who offered her some food and she was starving. And he said, "Oh, that must have been great you ate." And she said, "No, I didn't. It was pork. I couldn't eat it." And he's like, "But you're starving." And her comment was like, basically, if I forget the precise quote, I could pull it up, but she says, if nothing means anything, what's worth living for, right? Like for her, that was such a transgression. The cultural baggage of it was such. Now, I could point out to you that the rabbis would say it would, like, if that's exactly as I said before, that's a moment where you 100% halachically, according to rabbinic law, for thousands of years, that is the precise moment when you're starving to death and someone offers you food, you can eat whatever it is to survive. In fact, many would argue you must at that moment. But for her, she said that thought. Now, after I wrote the book, I was reading the biography of Geddy Lee, the singer and bass player in the band Rush, and he's talking about him. His parents are Holocaust survivors. His real name is Gershon, and then in English it's Gary, and he gets his nickname Geddy because his mother in a Yiddish accent would constantly say, "Geddy, come over here. Geddy, come over here." And his friends heard Geddy, and therefore that became his nickname. So he goes to a big department store in Toronto with his family, and his dad says, "I'm going to go get some coffee." And so he stays with his mom for a while, and then he says, "I'm going to go find Dad." And he goes and he sees his dad eating bacon and eggs, and he sees him from afar, and he interprets that to mean, "Oh, it's all BS." I like to pair them because here are two Holocaust survivor stories. One saying, if I ate that, it would mean nothing. And someone else, and he viewed it to mean that his dad was still practicing outwardly, but he had lost faith in a certain sense, and that it was a freedom to act, right? You pair them together, you see that the symbol, they're still both using pig to signify something. And so you could take I often will say to people, what answer do you want? And I can give it to you. If you say, I don't want to eat pig, I can give you all the reasons why. And the argument would basically come down to, it means so much to Jewish communities. To eat that seems so powerfully against everything. And then if you say, I want to eat it, but I want a reason for it, you could flip the argument on the other hand and say, it has been used that way, but it also can be a symbol of resistance. And there's a difference between being forced to do something and choosing to do something. And you being a part of a group that has survived, one of the benefits of surviving has the opportunity to think about how you wish to act. And especially if you're doing it connecting to Jewish identity, right? One of the fascinating things about studying Jewish history, and it's riotously diverse. And trying to define Judaism is very difficult, because one of the things I would argue is your definition needs to be broad enough to encompass everyone who claims a Jewish identity. And if you're making it that broad, its analytical use means nothing. And that's fascinating, that tension between that. The cover of my book is from a drawing. It's a wonderful pig doodle that was made by Isaac Bashevis Singer. And he was a vegetarian who would sign his name by drawing a pig. And that's actually the first attested example of him signing. He was sending a postcard to a fellow Yiddish poet who was also a vegetarian. And he says in Yiddish, "Ashenim Dank, thank you very much. Ich bin ein, I am a," and he drew a picture of that, a chazer, a pig. Right? He was staking an identity, a Jewish identity, but using a pig to say it's kind of a transgressive Jewish identity. But what's more Jewish than that? And that's what you get to from this. It's not a single stable meaning. It's so flexible.
That's kind of where I want to land with the final closing question, which I'm hearing, Dan said this before, or it implied it maybe. I'll say it now. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Jordan, but like, pigs are pretty Jewish.
Yes.
Pigs are very Jewish. Like, and I'm flashing to a class I took in college. It was called Religion and Culture, and it's sat with me for all sorts of reasons. But I remember the first day of class, the professor put up a bunch of pictures of different things and just asked the class, is this a picture? Is this a religion picture? Like, is what's in this photo related to religion? One of the pictures was of a bacon cheeseburger. Like, the spoiler was that, like, right, every single one, in the professor's opinion, could be tied to religion, could be tied to culture. The whole point was that religion and culture aren't separate. Yeah. But, like, I remember being there, and I was kind of nervous, and I didn't want to speak up. But my instinct was, yeah, the bacon cheeseburger is a religious thing. Like, this class was mostly people who weren't Jewish. But for me, like, that's a subject matter that I have spent my life thinking about with, you know, my Jewish hat on. And that means both my literal yarmulke and even when I haven't been wearing a yarmulke, which is another journey I've been on. But like, that feels so important. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's trivial to say, like, this is a little less of a question and more of a moment for me to say a take I think is a Judaism Unbound take. What makes something Jewish isn't the fact that a Jewish text says it is permitted or says it should be done. Like, what makes a day of the year Jewish isn't that a Jewish text says that that day is a Jewish holiday. What makes it Jewish is that Jews engage with that day in ways that they find Jewish meaning in, which is a circular definition. It doesn't really help, because you could just say, well, the Jews can make any day of the year a Jewish holiday. And I would say to that, yes, that is what I'm saying. Yeah. And so pigs, by that metric, are among the most Jewish foods, maybe the most Jewish food, at least arguably, that one could think of, because the number of Jews who have spent time that they sort of sit with Jewishly and use that time to think about their relationship to bacon is higher than the number who have thought about that with even wine. Wine might be high on the list because we have it on a lot of Jewish days. But like, how can this help us not just think differently about pig and people who eat it or don't, but recognize ways in which we can understand Judaism more expansively and less just as sort of the set of things said in canonical Jewish texts?
Jewish history is a story when people will often talk about, this goes back to Mark Twain right there, what's the secret of Jewish survival, right? Spoiler alert, there's not one answer. What you find is different Jews in different times and places have made different decisions. There's not a essential, stable anything. Different Jews in different places trying to make meaning of the world around them, taking an inherited tradition, accepting, rejecting, arguing with, nuancing, metamorphosizing, right? All sorts of changes and interactions with it. Just imagine it like tofu, right? Tofu doesn't necessarily have a flavor. It has a texture, right? And I view texture as that tradition that you inherit. And then the flavoring is the world around you. What does it bring? That's why Jewish food looks very Mexican in Mexico, Spanish in Spain, German in Germany, etc., right? And Jewish practices take on the world around them. If you're looking for a way to understand Jewish identity in its riotous diversity. The pig is a great way to do that, because what I argue and what I keep finding since publishing this book is so many Jews and non-Jews have spent thousands of years talking about Jewish identity, wringing their hands about Jewish identity, struggling with internally, externally, leaving, staying within, making meaning out of their identity through the pig. So you're right, it's quite Jewish to have a stance on it. I can't resist pointing out that it does a bacon cheeseburger is no more non-kosher than a bacon burger, because according to the rabbis, the laws of mixing milk and meat only apply to a meat that has the potential to be kosher. So you don't violate milk and meat by having a bacon cheeseburger, because the meat burger and the cheese is the problem. The bacon and the cheese is not a problem. If you're still eating bacon, that's a problem, but that's for another time. You're right, it is, and the reason is because it springs to mind with that. You're connecting it to all of these things, and there's that history. So the story with, and again, I keep coming back to this thing because it really annoyed me, that person who fundamentally misread my book, where he said, you're celebrating that, and I can't get over that. And I would say, no, I'm not celebrating it. What I'm saying is I'm bringing it into the conversation. You're pushing it out by saying you shouldn't be celebrating it. I'm not policing any boundaries. What I'm interested in is how so many different Jews and non-Jews have used the pig to talk about what it means to be Jewish. Why exclude a bunch of people, particularly when you look at some of these texts that I was looking at, who are really, who eat the pig, but are talking about it in such a ways that are celebrating a Jewish identity. To eat the pig as a Jew means something to them, right? They're not saying, I just eat food. They're talking about their Jewish identity. And so to push that off the map of what is Jewish is intellectually and personally offensive to me. And I'm not saying one approach is better or worse. I'm saying they're equally worthy of our consideration. And if you're someone who's invested in that personally, what it offers you is, to use a nice metaphor and pun, right, a menu of options. To look at the pig and say, no matter where the pig is on your menu, right, in the not served at this restaurant to only served in every dish, anywhere in between, there are ways of understanding a Jewish identity there. And that's, to me, a positive thing as a scholar and as a person who identifies as Jewish. There's so many ways that can be used to have that conversation, and you can change your mind tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Jordan Rosenblum, for joining us. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As a reminder, the certificate program, the Unyeshiva's certificate program in Unbound Judaism, has applications open, but that won't remain true for much longer. The application deadline is June 15th, Sunday, June 15th. So head to judaismunbound.com/certificate right away. Check out the description of the program, fill out the initial info form, and then you'll receive the materials to be able to fill out your application. We hope that you'll race there and consider this incredible opportunity for immersive Jewish learning and unlearning. As we close, we also want to encourage you, as always, to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook or Instagram pages. Both of those are at Judaism Unbound for our handles. Second, you can go to our website, judaismunbound.com. Check out show notes for this episode and all sorts of other goodies on our website. Third, you can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. And on that front, if you're interested in sponsoring an episode of Judaism Unbound, if you would like to have your name read proudly at the beginning of a Judaism Unbound episode, that is now an opportunity that is available to you. So please do send me an email, lex@judaismunbound.com, if sponsoring an episode of Judaism Unbound is something that you'd be interested in. We hope to fill the airwaves with shout-outs to many of our listeners. It can be you individually or an organization you work for, if you would like to sponsor an episode or multiple. Thanks so much for listening. We really, really appreciate journeying our way through contemporary Judaism with you. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.